Okay, this is Tom Ryan Remembers. This is 2020, in November 24th. This is our third in the resurrected section of the podcast. We could actually call it a podcast. I don't know, but the last two have been focused on Maryland, and I think this is the third in the series. And uh, the question we with the last one we got up to Marilyn just before she met you, and uh, and so now we'll continue on, kind of skip over the uh, well, no, we'll continue on, and I guess let's see, Marilyn. After she met you, uh, then you guys dated for quite a while. But I guess my first question is, where was I conceived? Where was I conceived?
Oh, where was Kevin conceived? Well, there's a little tale of story to that. Um, After 3 years of celibacy, the two of us had a lot of time to make up. So when we got married uh, at Immaculate Conception Church, big Catholic wedding, we were both Catholics then. She had converted to Catholicism. Marilyn June Halterman Ryan, that's her name. And we got married after 3 years of dating. And of course, she'd say, well, you were in the Army most of that time. That's true. I got out of college, couldn't get my deferment extended by teaching in a country school. That didn't work. So I had to go in the Army for 2 years. And then I went on the GI Bill to the University of Illinois at Champaign, Urbana, to get a master's degree. And then I worked in the summer as a
Sorry,
military.
can I ask you how long did that take to get the master's degree?
Only a year,
Uh,
but and now I went back to the University of Illinois because I could get a master's in 1 year. And it was, so I was busy, I guess, but still, we were planning to get married and couldn't get married because Maryland had to finish nurses training. And if you got married before you finished, they kicked you out and you never got your registered nurse license.
mhm.
So she wanted, her mother had done that and gotten married and never did. And then later, way years later, she got her registered nurse degree. So Marilyn didn't want that to happen, and so we had celibacy for 3 years. Now, now we got married at Immaculate Conception, and we had a short honeymoon. I didn't want to jeopardize my job carrying mail. It was good pay, and they would take me anytime at Christmas, and I got a lot of money out of the post office department to help put me through college. So I took only 3 day honeymoon. We went up to Lake Delavan, right across the border, right near Lake Geneva. Now, Lake Geneva is a fancy place where a lot of rich people go, but near it is Lake Delavan, which is for more poorer people, and we were certainly poor. I that we stayed in a little cabin. It was really kind of run down. In fact, they tore down all those old cabins and built fancy new ones with high rent uh, right after we got or had our honeymoon there. So we were lucky to get these cheap cabins, and we spent a lot of time in the cabin. But we also went swimming and rode horses at the riding stable, and I had asthma as a kid and pretty severe. And about the time I was a teenager, I said it went away when puberty came. I lost the asthma, but still once in a while I'd get a case of it. And anyway, I thought the asthma was gone. I never had trouble with it in the army or anything, so I had it disappeared. So anyway, we had our 3 days of horseback riding and swimming. We went to back to Waukegan, and Aunt Ag, Judy, my mother's sister, had a room down in their basement. The Dudicks, Uncle Jim had made. He was handy with wood, and he built this room. They were going to rent it out, and so they rented it to us. So we didn't have to stay with our parents after we got married. We had our own little apartment down in the basement of Aunt Ag's house. And then when the summer was over and I carried mail that summer, we went down to Champaign, Urbana. Now, Marilyn didn't have her registered nurse certificate from the state of Illinois, which made her a registered nurse. It hadn't arrived yet. She had to take a test, of course, and all that. And she passed it all and graduated, but she didn't have the paper in her hand. But she went over to a hospital. We rented a house right on University Avenue in Champaign, and we were upstairs. And the landlord that rented us the apartment said that our apartment used to be 2 apartments. It was a little bedroom about just big enough for a bed, double bed, and then the kitchen. And that's all there was to it. And then there are 2 other guys that rented the apartment across from us. And we had to share a bathroom with them. And it was cheap. And we were only going to be there a semester. I had 1 more semester on my master's degree on the GI Bill. And then I'd get a job. And I did. But Marilyn, got a job at the little hospital across the road from us on University Avenue. And it was a private hospital and a lot of patients. And they had a little girl there that she took care of with a club foot. And the hospital, I think for free, the family couldn't afford it, was going to correct the club foot for the little girl. She was like 3 years old. And Marilyn said, is she going to stay here the whole weekend? She was not going to be operated on until Monday. And she's going to be here all by herself. Her family lives way in southern Illinois. And she said, can I take her home with me? They'd never let anybody do this now, insurance and being sued and all that. But yeah, they said that'd be really nice. A poor little kid being a 3-year-old in a baby bed and couldn't move around the hospital, and be pretty hard on her. So we had this little smiling 3-year-old girl in our little apartment. And then we took her places and we had the most fun with her, and then brought her back to the hospital on Monday morning, and she was operated on. But we didn't stay there very long after that. I think it was in January that I graduated, and I didn't even stay for the graduation to get my master's degree. I said, just send it to me in the mail. And we took off for Chillicothe, Illinois. I had been hired by a superintendent who came over from Chillicothe, Illinois, near Peoria, and he interviewed me, and he had a contract right in his pocket. And usually you have to go through the school board and all that, but he was glad to get me.
Just wanted to say, Chicago is up north, and Champaign is about 3/4 of the way down the state, and Peoria is kind of halfway
miles away from Elgin, and Chillicothe was more like 100 miles away in the other direction. It was along the Illinois River that flows into the Mississippi, and this was a little town, not Chillicothe, Ohio. This is Chillicothe, Illinois. Very little town, and it was 20 miles or so from Peoria, where most of the people worked. They would commute. A lot of the people commuted.
There's a big international harvester plant there, yeah.
Right, big international harvester, and they paid good. They had unions, and it was like the auto industry. So I moved down there, and we did not need a moving truck. We had no furniture. That little apartment was furnished, and all we had is our clothing and a few doodads, and we had them in the back seat of the little Studebaker that we had. I think we had a mop handle sticking out the window in the back. We couldn't quite make it fit inside the car, and that was and we got into the Studebaker and we drove to Chillicothe and I think that Kevin was probably conceived in that little apartment when we were, I was finishing up my one semester in my master's degree. But we had an apartment in Chillicothe. They kind of arranged for us. And because we were the new school teacher, this woman had a beautiful apartment above the hardware store right on Main Street in Chillicothe, right next to the movie theater. And we could hear the movie theater through the wall sometimes. It was a noisy movie. And we were upstairs, and it had a grand piano in the living room. And we had moved in there, just the two of us. But that's where Kevin was born. Well, he was born in Peoria at St. Francis Hospital, but Marilyn went into labor for their first child, and we got her in the car and away we went for Peoria, and Kevin was born there. And so we came back and we stayed there for a while with Kevin, the newborn. And then we thought, well, by the way, Marilyn got pregnant again, and she was pregnant with Dan. So we went and looking for a house, a real house. And we got a kind of a post-World War II quick housing, cheap housing house in Chillicothe on Barron Avenue. And it was within walking distance of the high school. That was another advantage to it. And when we lived there, we made friends with, Kevin was born, and we were going to go up to Waukegan for his baptism at Immaculate Conception Church with all the relatives there. And we met the pastor of the Chillicothe Catholic Church, and he was at work having dinner in a restaurant. And so we said, oh, well, Father, we sat down for a minute and talked to him. We're going to Waukegan tomorrow, and we're going to have Kevin baptized. And he said, oh, you're not going to drive 200 miles with a baby that isn't baptized. You have to get Kevin baptized before you go. He says, you just come right over to the church right now, and I'll come over there and we'll baptize Kevin. And I said, well, what about all the relatives? I think, well, he says, you can't get baptized twice. That's against the rules, but they can baptize you in Waukegan with all the relatives conditionally. It's on condition that I made some mistake when I did it, and I didn't, do it just properly, and it didn't take. And, it's kind of like medicine. You have to get baptized right way or it doesn't work. So, okay, Father, whatever you say, we had to obey the priest, whatever he said. And so we went over there and we baptized Kevin. There were just, I forget who else was there, but mostly it was just the three of us, the priest and the two of us and Kevin. So then the next morning we headed for Waukegan, where Kevin was baptized conditionally with all the relatives and the sponsors and all of that. And we made a big day of it. But then we had to go back to Chillicothe, and I had to teach. And so we were only in Waukegan for a few hours, actually. So again, the Studebaker took us back to Chillicothe and with the baby now in Marilyn's arms. And so I think there's some more questions there you have.
Right. Okay. Let's see. So Marilyn first worked as a nurse with the hospital in Chillicothe. No, it was in Champaign. In Champaign. Okay.
Right. She got a job as a registered nurse without a proof of her registration, but it arrived in the mail finally, and so she had this registered nurse. You could be a registered nurse. You work your way through by doing a lot of drudgery in the hospital, and it only cost, the tuition was $300 a year. And she asked her father if he would pay the $300 a year so she could go to nurses training. And he said he would. And I remember her saying that he didn't send the money in on time, and she had to keep dunning him to send in the $300 check to the hospital. They were bugging her about the fact that it hadn't arrived, but he did pay for that nurse's training, but mostly she worked for it
Uh-huh.
and paid for it by her labor. They used them as nurses' aides, really. And I can remember her telling about how she worked in the diet kitchen. And at that time, they didn't really have insulin down what right. And it was very hard. A lot of diabetics were very fragile, it was called. And so she would weigh the food in the kitchen and weigh a piece of meat or potatoes or whatever, and then follow a dietary menu so that the victim, who was a patient in the hospital for something else probably, was given the right diet for their diabetes. And so she remembered that. She worked in a,
That's curious. That's curious because Ginger last Sunday was just saying about her diet. And she says, I have to weigh everything. Yeah. So,
yes, all the things you like, you can't eat. And yeah, Ginger probably inherited that from Marilyn, who inherited it from her mother. They were all diabetics, and it's a rough disease and
yeah,
messy. And Marilyn, of course, all the time we were married, she gradually would get worse and worse with the diabetes, and by the end, she was taking insulin. But at first, they tried to treat it with medication, and so far,
but
Ginger, who's about almost 60,
yeah,
she can handle it with medication other than insulin.
right.
She's
But
so
back to so Marilyn was weighing food for the people in the hospital, right?
right, not for herself. This is for patients. She didn't discover she had diabetes till much later, and it didn't seem to interfere with being pregnant with three kids in a row. Or it was much later than that that she discovered she too, like her mother, had diabetes.
Uh-huh.
And she knew how to treat it. I can remember seeing Marilyn with a whole bunch of pills on the counter in the kitchen. And then she had this pill box, and she would pick out the right pills to put in the pill box so that she'd take every day a whole handful of pills.
Yeah.
I said, "You've got to show me how to do this, because you may be sick and can't. Well, I won't know which pills to put in the box and give to you." So, but I never did. I mean, she took care of it. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm a nurse. I know what to do, and she
But
did it.
back to the yeah, the nurse, but you were thinking about going to Alaska?
Oh yes, when I was in Alaska, in the Army, I thought it was a wonderful place. I was way up on the Arctic Circle near Fairbanks, Eielson Air Force Base, and I was in the Army there. And I liked Alaska a lot. And I said, Marilyn, when you graduate from nurses training, we'll get married and we'll go to Alaska, and I'll teach school in some little one room school with the Eskimos. And you can work in the little hospital there, and we'll have a wonderful adventure in Nome, Alaska. That was the goal. And it's really way up on the Arctic Circle. So that was the plan. But when Marilyn got pregnant, we decided going up there and having a baby in Alaska and Nome would be a little difficult. And then taking care of the baby, of course, afterward would be even more difficult. So that the dream of going to Alaska ended right there when Marilyn found out she was pregnant with
So
Kevin.
I made the change, huh?
Yeah. So now Marilyn hadn't worked as a nurse except that short time in Champaign when we had the little girl with the club foot. And Marilyn was going to stay now that she was having kids. She didn't want her kids to be taken care of by babysitters. She wanted to take care of them because of her unhappy childhood with having strangers take care of her. So she didn't work, and we never had. I always took care of the kids when occasionally she would work for a short time during summer when I was off school, and I'd take care of your kids. That was hard work. I remember one summer I volunteered. I said, "You can work all summer, and I'll take care of the kids all summer, and that'll give you a break, and it'll be good for me." And when that summer was over, I said, "Never again do I want to take care of three little kids running around the house all summer.
Too much
That's
work, right?
hard work." But it was a good experience. So that many times when Marilyn would work for a short period, I'd take care of your kids, and I got to know my kids better than most fathers in those days. Were busy outside the home and didn't hardly know their own kids.
So
Anyway,
I want to get the date line down here. So I was born in June of 1956. So I was probably conceived in September, somewhere around there in 1955. You guys were married in June, or
yeah,
sorry, in August of 1955.
yeah,
So it was about a month after. But at that time, you guys were both in Champaign, Urbana, and you were finishing up your school. You finished up in January, and then you moved directly to Chillicothe.
right. So there wasn't any. Yeah, the reason I remember on Mother's Day, which is in May, we went back to Waukegan to celebrate Mother's Day with my mother, and we went to a restaurant, the Rustic Manor in Gurnee, Illinois. I can remember that, and we sat down and we said, "Well, uh, we're going to have a baby, but uh, the baby, how did I put that? The baby won't be born for 9 months after, 9.5 months after we got married." And my mother went,
Whoa.
"Phew,"
Yeah, that's a
in
close
those
one.
days to have a baby out of wedlock would be just terrible. So we made it by a whisker. So
Yeah,
I think it was only a matter of 9 months and 2 weeks or something
right.
after our
Yeah.
marriage that
Okay,
we
but in the interim, while she was pregnant, then so you finished up in Champaign, and then you moved to Chillicothe with
right
trips up to Waukegan for lots of different stuff. But
back and forth to Waukegan.
yeah,
And
so now
and
you were in the Studebaker most of the time. How did you get all your stuff from Champaign to Chillicothe?
just in the back seat of the suit, we didn't have stuff, but we were travel light, and we arrived in Chillicothe, and this apartment that we rented above the hardware store had a grand piano in the living room. It was furnished. The lady that rented it to us was lived in another town, and she had lived there, and she just left all her furniture there. So we used everything of hers, and we still didn't have any furniture when, after a year living there, and we moved into the house on Barron Avenue. Then we had to get some furniture, uh, and that's when Dan was born, and he was born in June, and Kevin was born in June, a
Okay,
year
yeah, but
apart.
back to that time. So you moved into Chillicothe in January, right? So and
Yeah, right.
the school year begins in September.
Oh yeah, I didn't explain that. The guy I replaced in teaching social studies there at the little 400 student school with 20 teachers, he went off to be principal of a school in Fisher, Illinois, in another little town, and he abandoned them in the middle of the school year. Now that's kind of bad, but they needed a principal, and he wanted to get the job, so away he went. And that's why the principal came all the way over to the Champaign, Urbana, and recruited me. And I think he would have hired me, just check that I was breathing. He just needed a teacher, and I was a beginner. And I'd had some experience in the Army teaching, but teaching kids in school I only had was practice teaching, which lasts about 6 weeks. I think teachers need a longer uh, actual hands-on
So
teaching
normally
before they start. But
normally they
I,
start you out with like the lowest grade, right? Ninth grade or something like that. Is that what you taught?
yeah, so I I taught several subjects, world history, US history. I can't remember, that's 20 years ago, more than. And I enjoyed that in Chillicothe. I learned that I like teaching.
Uh-huh.
And I got involved in a lot of community activities in the town, and everybody would recruit the teacher because we had skills that they could use outside the classroom.
Uh-huh.
And so it was a good time, a fun time. One thing, we went friends with the assistant priest at the Catholic Church, Father Woolner, and he hadn't been a priest very long, so he was probably about our age. And he would come over. He was, I'm sure, a lonely job being a priest. And the old priest was kind of a crabby guy. I can imagine it wasn't. But you know, when a teacher would get sick and the principal got a call that the teacher wasn't going to come in, they would call the pastor of the Methodist church and see if he could sub. And if he couldn't, they'd call the rectory at the Catholic church and see if Father Woolner would sub. So he did a lot of subbing at the high school, and he'd get maybe $100 for doing that. But it was a contact that these pastors had. It was a big advantage to them. They meet the kids, and maybe they'd get them to come to church, and they knew some of the kids because half the kids probably in the class were Catholic, and the other half went to the Methodist church. So they knew these kids, and so it was a great experience. And another thing, when we lived in the house, Father Woolner said, we have girls that get pregnant in little farm towns, and Catholic Charities wants to find a place where they can live until they deliver their baby. The baby then is already arranged for adoption by a family, and the girl doesn't allow to see her baby even for a minute. And the baby is handed over to the adoptive parents, and the girl goes back to her little town in Illinois or farm town, and nobody knows that she delivered a baby out of wedlock. That's the way they did it. And they wondered if we would be willing to house the girl for the time from when she starts showing, they called it. Her abdomen shows that she's going to have a baby to the time she actually has one. So we said, sure, we'd do that. And we had two different girls that would came. And I think probably Father Woolner thought it would be good to see, for those girls to see a woman with two little babies a year apart. One, you were about 2 years old and Dan was 1 year old, and how much work it is in case she had some idea that she could take her own baby and take care of it and raise the baby.
Uh-huh.
She didn't really have any choice but to have it adopted. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
we did that twice with two different girls, and then they went back. We never heard from them again. Of course, it was an embarrassing time for them, and I don't think they wanted to continue. But we enjoyed the experience. And then we had a boy named Bodie. Uh, Bodie, I can't remember his name now, but he came from Catholic Charities, and he was kind of an orphan, had been abandoned by his family, but he was a teenager, and he went to school at
In
Chillicothe
Chillicothe.
High, where I was teaching, and we housed him too, and that was shortly before we left Chillicothe. We only stayed there 2.5 years because right after Kevin was born in June, my mother was killed in an auto accident at the railroad tracks in Waukegan on her way home from church. And so uh, we already had Dan. We were living in the Barron house. We went up there for the funeral, and I can remember the principal calling us on the phone and saying, "Gee, you've been gone 3 days, I think it was. We need you back here in Chillicothe to teach." I
Uh-huh.
said, "Oh, okay, I can, there's not anything more I can do for my father here." So I came back and taught during that time.
Uh-huh.
And so we decided that we would move closer to Waukegan, which was 200 miles from Chillicothe. And
And now
so
that you
we,
had some experience that you could get a
now I
better,
have experience. Yeah, I proved that I could survive 2.5 years of teaching. And so I got a job. I had to go up to Waukegan and be interviewed. I got a real grilling with about 4 people around the table grilling me on my teaching. And then they hired me. So I was going to start the next school year in Elgin, Illinois. And the pay was more, much more. Elgin was more prosperous than Chillicothe, and they had better money from their
property
tax on
taxes.
houses.
Yeah.
Mostly the money came from a house tax, and that doesn't bring in much money. Anyway, it was all scheduled. So I was only getting $1,800 a year in Chillicothe. No wonder they had a hard time getting teachers. And I told them that I was going to leave, but they let me work at the post office in Chillicothe that summer. And I carried mail and I did janitor work at the Chillicothe post office. I think it helped that a graduate of Notre Dame, a very good Catholic, was the postmaster, and I went to the Catholic Church. Anyway, it was, I needed the money to support. I had a family with 2 kids and not much money from the teaching job. So away we went from Chillicothe
Chillicothe to Elgin.
up to Elgin.
Now,
But
at that time,
first,
did you need a van to take your stuff?
now we had a moving truck, yes. It wasn't much of a moving truck. We got the cheapest one we could get. When he arrived in Elgin, we'd rented a house on Dundee Avenue, the busiest street in Dundee, and we had a whole house, but it was very small, 2 bedrooms upstairs and living room and kitchen downstairs, and then a basement. So Marilyn could do the washing in the basement, and the 2 kids were now like 3 years old and 2 years old, and they got loose one day, and they ran down Dundee Avenue, the busiest street, and they got down to the bus stop, and Marilyn finally, she was in the basement washing. She thought they were, I don't know, napping or
Sleeping,
something.
yeah.
Sleeping. So she goes running down the street to save them from the traffic, and they were just swinging around the pole at the stop sign pole, and stoplight pole, and at the end of the street. So we decided we needed to get a fence to keep the kids in the backyard so they didn't wander off. So I went down to the lumber yard and I said I needed a cheap fence and what I wanted it for. And we were going to leave it there after we moved out of that house. So we wouldn't. And they said, well, we got this chicken fence. It's got wood in wood slats and then wire that keeps the chickens from wandering all over the farm. And so I could put that up. And so I put that up all around the yard. And by the way, we didn't have any money to pay for it. So I asked them if I could pay for it after my check came in. And they said, oh yeah, you're a school teacher. You're
good for it.
Pay whenever you can. They trusted us.
Uh-huh.
They trusted that we would pay our bill. And so we did. Something happened to the light there.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to stop, actually, the arrival in Elgin, and then we can continue on from there in another episode.
Yeah.
Okay.
Marie's birth.
Right.
Big
Yeah, from Marie on. Okay, that sounds good.
Okay,
let's.
that's enough.
Yeah.